Hello everyone, and welcome to Light and Matter's first video series on black and white photography. My name is Matthew Gore. This video is called Black and White Photography, but it might be better to call it Black and White Photography Post-Processing in Photoshop CS5 or something like that, although that's a little bit unwieldy. But most of what happens these days in black and white photography is actually post-processing. The capture of the images is exactly the same, or at least it should be the same as color. That is, of course, if we're talking about digital photography, and most of us are these days, but that's a point that I'm going to come back to in just a moment. One of the great things about working in Photoshop is that it is so incredibly flexible. I can think of at least 5 or 6 different ways off the top of my head to convert a photograph from color to black and white. But of course, with that flexibility comes the complexity of deciding which way is the best way to do it, and there are definitely good ways and bad ways. So a lot of this video is going to be about all of those different ways of converting your photos from color to black and white, and which methods are the best, which are going to produce the best results. If you've made it this far into the video, it's probably fair to let you know what you're in for. So here is a little table of contents for what you can expect from the rest of the video. I'm going to begin by saying a few words about black and white capture. It's not a whole lot of information, but it is important, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Then I'm going to go over this variety of black and white conversion methods, and some of them will take a long time, some of them I'll just pass over really quickly, and then I will geek out for a little bit. I'm not going to try to explain that here, you'll see when we get there. And then I'm going to go over a couple of additional examples using these conversion methods that I outlined up here. A couple of them in Camera Raw, a couple of them in Photoshop, and then that'll be it. Then I will hold off on everything else for the next video. So let's get started. Even though most of this video series is going to be about post-processing, I at least want to say a few words about the capture process. Now, I said a moment ago that when we capture black and white photos, we should do it the same way that we capture color photos, which is to say, we should capture color photos in the camera and later on convert those color images to black and white. And I want to explain that in a little bit more detail. There are actually a few different reasons why it's better to capture your image in color and then convert to black and white. First of all, if you shoot in black and white in your camera, then your camera is deciding how it's going to translate the colors in the world into black and white tones. And that takes you out of the process, and to me, that seems like giving up part of the artistry of the process. But probably a more important reason to capture in color is that whenever you capture in RAW mode, you're capturing in color. If you're capturing in black and white in your camera, that means that you're capturing in JPEG. And that is a huge difference in the amount of data that you're capturing. Look at it this way. If you're shooting JPEG, that means that you're shooting 8-bit files. 8-bit files are capable of 256 shades of gray. Take a look at this. Here we have an 8-bit file, 256 shades of gray. If you shoot RAW instead, most cameras that are 4 or 5 years old shoot 12-bit files in RAW, and that is 4,096 shades of gray instead. That means that you're getting, with a RAW file, roughly 16 times as many shades of gray as if you're shooting a JPEG, an 8-bit file. If you're shooting a more modern camera, all of Canon's current lineup and most of Nikon's current lineup shoot 14-bit files. That is 16,000 versus 256 shades of gray. Having all of these extra shades of gray in your photo lets you do a lot more manipulation with the data that you have without getting nasty side effects. So for example, you can increase the contrast, you can change the tonal ranges, and you don't get banding and posterization and ugly transition between tones that you do get if you only have 256 shades of gray to work with. In a moment, I'll show you a photographic example of this, or at least I'll try to show you a photographic example. But in the meantime, just keep in mind, shoot raw, and that means, by default, shoot in color. This picture should be a decent example of the difference that it makes to have a 16-bit file versus an 8-bit file. This picture was originally taken with a Nikon in RAW format, which was 14-bit. And here I've opened it as a 16-bit file, and here as an 8-bit file. They are otherwise identical. If you take a look at the histogram over here, I didn't mean to do that, histogram, it is the same from the 8-bit to the 16-bit. And just in case you're curious, this is what it looked like color, which is a little bit more interesting, but not such a good example. So, to begin with, I'm going to make a levels adjustment layer for my 16-bit file. You can see that my data point starts right about here. So I'm going to move my white point down to where the data begins. That's my brightest highlight, which is actually down here in this wheat field. I'm going to move my black point up to actually about 25. And just to accentuate this a little bit, I'm going to move my midpoint to about 1.2. So you can see that I've got a little bit more contrast in the image, and if I click on the histogram, you can see that the tones are spread out a little bit more. I've got some pure blacks here, probably a little bit more than I should, and I do have some pure whites. Now, I'm going to make the same changes to the 8-bit file. 25, 1.2, 221. Okay. Now, the two images should still look exactly the same, and they do pretty much, except that the sky doesn't look quite as good on the 8-bit file. On your screen, you probably can't tell a difference at all. They probably both have banding. On my monitor, I'm seeing a little bit of banding in the sky here between the gray tones. What you can see on your monitor is that when you refresh the histogram here, you've got all of this banding in the information in the histogram, whereas with the 16-bit file, it's still all continuous tones. What this means is that for each little line here in the histogram that is white instead of black, each of those lines represents a tone of gray that is missing, completely missing from this photo. So there's a jump from one gray to the next, which is, instead of being a nice, continuous, smooth gradation, it creates these bands in the sky. Again, you probably can't see it, and I'm sorry about that, but maybe I can accentuate this a little bit, and let's see. What if I Take this down even further. Take this the other way. Well, this probably still isn't going to help. I'm going to abandon this whole idea. But that's a better example, at least, sort of a more visual example of the fact that having more data to work with to begin with leaves you room for adjustment later, and that leaves you with smooth tonal gradations and a better overall image. Okay, as I said before, there are a lot of different ways in Photoshop to convert a color image to black and white. In fact, I'm about to go over 9 or 10 of them in this video series. But to start off with, let's go with the easiest, which also happens to be about the least useful. I'm going to begin by going up to the Image menu, selecting Adjustments, and then selecting Desaturate. And it does exactly that. It sucks all of the color out of the image, it leaves all of the color channels intact, but there's simply no color. And you end up with an image that is pretty dull, not a lot of contrast, not a lot of snap, but it is a grayscale image now. Okay, so let's try something else. Let me undo this first by going to Undo, Desaturate under the Edit menu. You can also press Ctrl-Z, and that gets me my color back. Alright, the next conversion method is actually very similar. You begin by going up to the Image menu again, you click on Mode this time, and then select Grayscale. This time we get a warning message that says Discard Color Information. You click on Discard, and there you go. You've got a grayscale image. The major difference this time is that if you go to the Channels palette, there is no longer the RGB information, the RGB channel, the red, the green, and the blue channels. All you have is this grayscale image. And you got that grayscale image without having any choice as to how your color tones were converted over to grayscale tones. So again, this method is not very flexible in that it doesn't give you much choice in how the conversion is made, and it's also destructive in that it gets rid of all of that color information permanently. Okay, I'm going to undo this one more time by pressing Ctrl-Z. Now we've got my color channels back and the color back into the image.